that line, "I'm going away to leave you, ain't coming back no more." It's how I felt about Jacksonville for a really long time. So I'm here today to tell you a bit of a story. It's a local story, sort of, about what it can mean to be from this place where the summer hum of cicadas is thick with multiple histories. And it's about how I, the Florida-born son of Afghan immigrants who left Kabul in 1967 when it was at its metropolitan peak to arrive in a still racially segregated Jacksonville, ended up dropping out of high school and swimming with existential gators. Now, I grew up on a street named after Robert E. Lee's horse in a community called Confederate Point. And I ate macaroni and cheese and hot dogs and raced my bike to the neighborhood pool, hung out drinking in parking lots and smoked joints before Pink Floyd laser shows at the Mosh, and listened to Lynyrd Skynyrd just like everybody else did. And they still called me sand nigger. And I boiled over and yelled and beat them up for it. But at least I knew early on which side of that fight I was on. I remember high school, my American history teacher, who proudly showed us Gone with the Wind as a historical lesson, and spent the next several classes extolling for us the virtues of the Confederate Army and its brave Southern generals. We spent barely one class discussing slavery. And the next year, I dropped out with a 3.4 GPA and an indifferent counselor. But it was around that time that I also fell in love for the first time, as truly and incompletely as only a teenager can. And her name was Zora Neale Hurston. And I was sitting down by the St. John's watching a cargo ship slowly and unsurely creep its way downriver, when, as if reading my mind, she leaned in close and whispered in my ear, "Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board." And I thought I could never love someone more than that. Not long after, I was walking down on Alachua Trail when I met Simone de Beauvoir. And just as I was negotiating myself around a group of alligators sunning themselves on the water's edge, not 5 meters away, she called out to me from the other side of the trail, "The oppressed can fulfill his freedom as a man only in revolt." And once again, I knew I was in love. And then I revolted like never before, against my father's God who demanded devotion through fear, against the ignorant racist who couldn't spot Atlanta on a map, much less Afghanistan, and against the place of my birth that never really fully accepted me. And then I left, chasing after those distant ships, to an Afghan rebel camp just outside Jalalabad, where I fired rockets at government tanks and drank sweet cardamom-scented green tea. To Europe, where I backpacked accidentally into a Scandinavian rainbow gathering where clothing was optional. To California, where Ed Kienholz's amazing junk installations inspired me to make art. I marched in the streets against American hegemony and got degrees in cultural anthropology. To Afghan refugee camps in Peshawar, where I assessed health and education needs and wrote proposals for foreign aid. To Washington, D.C., where I put on a suit and lobbied on Capitol Hill on behalf of Afghans who continue to suffer from decades of war. And finally, back to Afghanistan, where I sought to connect with the birthplace of my ancestors and maybe, just maybe, finally find a home. But they didn't really accept me either. And it was around this time that, after 10 years of living in Kabul, building schools in urban and rural communities, and distributing blankets during long snow-filled winters, supporting contemporary art among an entirely new generation of youth, that I realized I was still a foreigner there. And it's when I really had to start thinking about, what does it even mean to be from somewhere? To be someone who lives in a particular personal, political, or geographic reality. To be someone who has to constantly navigate themselves and their lives through these in-betweens, and how the experiences that we have within those spaces affect who we are and come to determine our perspective on the world. And so I started to think about what that means in terms of our own personal geography. And it became something that I started to call the geography of self. And it's rooted in existential humanism and the theories of Jean-Paul Sartre, who has said that every truth and every action is rooted in an environment and a human subjectivity. So an environment and a human subjectivity. And this is when I stopped looking for myself in Kabul. And I also stopped running from Jacksonville. And I started to try and think about how this coastal, subtropical environment shaped who I am today. It was around this time that an old friend of mine introduced me to Stetson Kennedy. I learned about how he infiltrated the KKK and fought for civil rights and collected folk stories across Florida. And that he was from Jacksonville. But then I also learned that it was with my first love, Zora, who he collected folk stories with in the 1930s. And it was my second love, Simone, who worked with Jean-Paul Sartre in Paris in the 1950s to publish Stetson's books on the KKK and Jim Crow laws, while the books were still banned from being published in America. It was then that my geography of self and Jacksonville's place within it became a bit more complicated. A place where the histories of Afghan immigrants and KKK infiltrators, Harlem Renaissancers, and French existentialists came together to influence my life in ways that I never could have imagined. Jacksonville became a place that contributed to how I, as Zora puts it, refused to weep at the world, but rather spent time sharpening my oyster knife. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had stereotyped Jacksonville in the same way that Jacksonville had stereotyped me. But it's even more confusing than that, because this is a place where private citizens can come together successfully in the name of justice to change the name of a high school that paid tribute to a founding member of the KKK, while at the same time, unimaginable education strategies are legalized to actually set different learning standards for students based on the color of their skin. Nevertheless, I came back to Jacksonville after many years, and like I used to, I took a canoe out on the St. John's. And I was keeping an eye out for gators. And if I spotted one, I would slowly follow it through the deep brown water. But I saw the gators a bit differently this time, like prehistoric philosophers, guardians, if you will, of everything that I had loved and learned and fought against here. And it made me think about another line from Blind Blake's Early Morning Blues. The day you dare to quit me, baby, that's the day you die. Just before I stood up and dove in the water.